That's the deal. In the second year of the war, Napoleon has been exiled. Now the army can come over here to chastise the savages, as the London Times put it. And so, an army of about 4,000 sail into the Chesapeake Bay, and the people here in this region are wondering, where are they going to go? Surely they'll come up to Baltimore, that thriving port with this river right here. Surely they'll come here. They'll burn that shipbuilding industry, because that's been a pain in the backside of the British. That's where they're going to go. But some people said, no, they'll go to Washington. That's our nation's capital. Well, why would they go there? There's only 8,000 people living here. It's mostly swamp. There's 50,000 people here. They'll go to Baltimore. Well, they went to Washington. Naturally, they fooled a lot of people. They landed their troops right here as they came up the bay and then the Patuxent River. They landed them here and they marched northward. And when they got right to the east of Washington, they headed this way into the town of Bladensburg. Now they were met by American militia. And the American militia outnumbered the British more than 2 to 1. They had cavalry and the British did not. And they had far more guns than the British did. So you would anticipate the night before, if you're checking the odds in Vegas, you know, the Americans are going to win. Well, don't forget, we had a really small regular army. So most of the men who were involved in fighting the British were militia, what we would now call reserves, National Guard kind of troops. And back in those days, the president thought they didn't need any training, because when they got in battle, they were protecting their homes. Surely they would do well. Well, the British soldiers that they faced had just defeated Napoleon. So they were riding high. They had just defeated, perhaps, the greatest general in the history of the world. And they had these very long bayonets that on a day like today would be gleaming in the sunlight. And when the militia saw that at Bladensburg, they did a 180 and headed west. Most of them, not everybody. There was some really good defense put up by some Navy guys and some Marines and some other militia. But for the most part, they all headed west. The British marched right into Washington, and they burned many of the Capitol buildings, including what was then called the President's House. So, September 1814, Washington has been burned. The British fleet now realizes, let's go get Baltimore. So they load their troops back onto the ships at Benedict, come down to Patuxent, into the bay, and they sail up the bay. And the people here who have seen the smoke rising a few weeks before from that direction in Washington, they know the gig is up. They know Baltimore is next. And the people here in Baltimore know that if the British get past Fort McHenry, or if the British can land downriver and approach the city from the east, it's going to burn. You know, there's no doubt about it. So, September 12th, 1814, the Battle of Baltimore begins. It's a two-pronged invasion. The soldiers, nearly 4,000, are landed right down the peninsula, about 7 miles that way. And they begin to march towards Baltimore from the east. Now they are met about 5 miles inland by the Baltimore Brigade of Militia. In Baltimore, we were not going to let the same thing happen here that happened in Washington. Of course, we knew the British were coming our way. And we had some men who turned out to be excellent militia. And they engaged the British in a battle that lasted about 90 minutes on land. And we had some really good news in the beginning of that engagement. The commanding officer of the British was shot dead, right off his horse. A man who took his place had never commanded a size of troop that large. So that's good news for the Americans right there. The second piece of good news is the militia did really well at the Battle of North Point. They held the British. They actually inflicted more casualties than they suffered, but they weren't large enough, and their objective was not to defeat the British, but rather hold them back while people were building defenses right across the river here. And building those defenses were men, women, black, white, everyone digging and digging to save their city. And so the British approached by land, and they realized in front of them was a mile of open ground because all the homes and the trees had been taken down. And in front of them was a militia that outnumbered them more than 4 to 1. And the British had virtually no cannon, and the American militia had more than 60 pieces. And so the British commander, that new guy, decided to wait to see if anything could happen at Fort McHenry that would give him a break. Maybe some of those militia would leave and go to Fort McHenry and he could exploit that. So that's the land engagement piece so far. The ships come up the river to within 2 miles. They begin a 24-hour bombardment of the fort. Fort McHenry's guns, many of them manned by naval gunners who had done well at Bladensburg. Fort McHenry has supporting cannon right across the river there. When you see that lighthouse, that's where they stood. Fort McHenry had supporting guns to the west of the fort. Fort McHenry had sunken ships in the river. Fort McHenry had a boom of masts across the river, right there, to stop ships. Fort McHenry had gunships behind all that. So the point I'm trying to make is that here, the defensive plan of Baltimore was really, really good. And the British bombarded for 24 hours and could not penetrate. And the commanding admiral realized it's not going to be worth it for me to try and get past all of this stuff. I'm going to pay a heavy price for that when I can leave and go someplace else. And they call that discretion, the better part of valor. I can leave and I can come back another day, or I can go to some place like New Orleans. I've heard they have a lot on their docks down in New Orleans. I guess he didn't hear about Andrew Jackson in New Orleans. But nonetheless, on the morning of the 14th of September, that British commanding officer decides, I can't do this. Let's go. And they go back to the ships. And not long after that decision is made by the Army commander, the admiral of the fleet here decides, I can't do this. They've held us up for 24 hours. It's too much of a price to pay. And so he too leaves with his ships. And so on the 14th, there's a small boat down the river with a fellow from Georgetown, Francis Scott Key. He's not a prisoner, but he's trying to get a prisoner released. If you saw the film, he was the guy with the spyglass. He's watched it all. The bombing has stopped. The smoke is clearing. The sky is clearing from the rain clouds. And suddenly, with the aid of a spyglass, because he's a number of miles down the river, he looks and sees a flag much larger than that one flying on a flagpole situated right there. And he realizes, we've won. We've won. After Washington burned, we just stopped the mightiest army in the world, and we just stopped the greatest navy in the world. We've won. And so he began to write what eventually became our national anthem and was eventually called the Star Spangled Banner.